What can we learn by looking back at a decade of media as data? About a decade ago, I started collaborating with the Internet Archive's Television News Archive to map out the geography of television news. At the time period, I was doing a lot of mapping of the geography of different forms of media, whether that was Twitter or Wikipedia or news, online news data. So television was a really fascinating one to ask, when we turn on our television sets at night and turn on the news, where are we hearing from? What are the stories that we're hearing from? Now, this was a huge bespoke pipeline of scripts and tools, and took weeks and weeks of compute time to make this happen. But it was sort of that first step of asking, how can we make television news computable? Fast forward a little bit, and the Internet Archive during the State of the Union addresses used audio fingerprints. So taking every sentence of that State of the Union address and then tracking across television news globally where that appeared. So when, for example, when Barack Obama would mention something about Iran, which of those statements appeared on Iranian state television? So what I did then was work on, how do we visualize that? You know, we have essentially this large data set, an Excel spreadsheet, if you will, of all the appearances, but how do we visualize that, make that accessible to journalists, scholars, and ordinary people? And then moving to political ads, and again, how do we visualize this type of data? Fast forward a little bit, and came n-grams. So this is essentially word frequency, so you can track out how often different words are mentioned over time. And this is really powerful. And let's start unlocking this ability to kind of understand, sort of the ebbs and flows of coverage. But again, at the time period, that was still 9 billion words, even back then. It's out of range unless you have enough compute power. So then in turn came the Television Explorer. So this was a turnkey tool. You go to it, you type in your keywords, and you get back a list of results and visualizations, so we can see how much something's getting mentioned over time, sort of the ebbs and flows. So essentially keyword search of television news. And now that's the spoken word, but it turns out there's a lot of on-screen text. So in turn, using video AI to basically perform OCR and extract all that on-screen text for searching in over 300 languages. Now in turn, fast forward to COVID, you can actually use that to look for who's telling the COVID story. So simply looking at the chirons, sort of the text at the bottom, we can say, well, look for any mention of doctor, and who's the doctor telling that story. So you actually make a day-by-day chronology of who's telling the COVID story on each channel. But then we can look for things like dashboards. So CNN's COVID dashboard, we can just look for the text of the credit line. Again, look for those ebbs and flows there. But of course, what makes television news so distinct is the visual landscape of it. So it recognizes about 20 to 30,000 objects and activities on screen. And so early on in the pandemic, we ran a statistical analysis and said, what's different about pandemic era television compared to before the pandemic? And what came out was bookcases. It's kind of like that, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. What's the meaning of life 42? Well, the sort of the meaning of television in COVID era has been bookcases. And we can see that here. We can see this huge surge there in the beginning, but we can see it's MSNBC and BBC News that bookcases really took off on. CNN and Fox News a lot less. And again, what this reflects is, starting pandemic, studios closed, everyone had to shoot from home, and everyone ran and found whatever sort of constituted a bookcase in their home to sort of convey that scholarship and authority. And that's a really fascinating question of how that came to be and why that became the iconic imagery of the COVID era. But fast forward a little bit more, and to do a lot of these analyses, we need to distinguish news and advertising. And historically, we do something like this graph you see at the top. You'd use all kinds of visuals, all these kind of statistical detections on the audio and video signals to look for transitions. But that's really, really error prone. And it turns out television news actually there's actually a signal built into it that actually tells you second by second whether it's advertising or news. It just involved extracting that. And again, all these hidden signals in the data around us each day. Now fast forward a little bit more, and we're using automated transcription. So for Russian, Belarusian, Ukrainian television news, we're actually using automated transcription, actually transcribe those out word by word, 42,000 transcripts, totaling over 2 gigabytes of text and climbing. So we actually take a Russian broadcast, transcribe it, and then translate into English. And then we actually display that in the overlay. So as you're watching the broadcast, you can actually see that. So for example, a journalist who wants to understand, well, what are they doing? How are they framing a particular event? How are they sort of internalizing that? So you can actually see what's said there. But of course, one of the interesting things about television is not just the spoken word, the visuals by themselves, but multimodal analysis. So scanning the on-screen text of all this television, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, since the start of 2020, we're able to go back and look for every appearance of a Trump tweet across that and connect that back and actually understand how in some cases when Twitter was flagging his tweets, they were actually backfiring on them. And so again, this ability to connect that, to connect television to the online world, social media. Now here's a case, a CNN broadcast, a clip of just somewhere in Russia, a COVID case. So again, being able to take this, we took this and ran a reverse Google images search across the open web and found the original source of this, and then scaled that up to an entire broadcast. Now this is really powerful because we're taking the world of broadcast and then actually taking that and then going second by second, and we're running a reverse images search to find other occurrences across the world, to connect the broadcast and the digital worlds. Now the future of this is something called the Visual Explorer. Many of the questions that we're most interested in are the visual representations of television news. Now, machines are really good. They can tell us about masks or golden retrievers or bookcases. But what they're not so good at is asking, well, who's telling that COVID story? Is this a leader at a podium looking strong and confident or weak? Or do they look concerned or dismissive? These are all these really complicated questions that machines are not as good at. But then also take something like inflation. What's the imagery? Now, a machine can tell us, well, there's a power plug or there's a grocery cart. But what is the narration there? So the visual narratives, when television news is talking about inflation, what are the visual representations they choose for that? And scale this up. The Russian invasion of Ukraine really brought this to the forefront. We needed this ability to understand this vast reams of television news. And war scholars in particular, journalists and scholars that cover war, they care a lot about the visual representations there. So how do we take a 24-hour-a-day television news broadcast and make that rapidly skimmable? So we want to, in other words, take the linear format of television and make it into a thumbnail grid. And there's a lot of ways you can do this, all kinds of different approaches. The end result is we found that extracting out one frame every 4 seconds and making that into a thumbnail grid makes television news skimmable. So you take an hour-long broadcast, becomes something like this, a thumbnail grid. We can instantly see what the core coverage is. And then you can click on that and play a 30-second clip of what was actually said there alongside the transcript. We're also looking at how machines can help us. So using machines to understand television news. And then again, each of those thumbnails that you see, that actually forms part of a non-consumptive at-scale research collection for journalists and scholars, totaling 3 billion images over 1 quadrillion pixels across 100 channels from 50 countries and territories in 35 languages and dialects over 20 countries on 5 continents. Again, all in collaboration with the Internet Archive's Television News Archive. We can do things like skits. So we can use those then, for example, to scan for logos. How is Western media being repurposed? We can count the number of people on screen. We can do OCR, logo detection. We can count human faces. So we can actually go through and say, is this single people speaking to a camera, or is these crowds? Like how is the story being told? We can compare channels, run them side by side over a major media event. So we can say, for example, this is when Donald Trump announced his candidacy, and we can see which channels covered it, which channels pivoted away. We can scan here. This is 30 different channels side by side to really show the rich diversity of television news across the world, just how different it focuses around the world. And then finally, we're using something now, we're exploring keyword visual search of the news. So this is something called Clip by OpenAI. You can literally type in the phrase soldier in front of a Russian flag and actually get back results. It's incredible what's possible now. And finally, so looking back on this, if you're interested, take this top QR code here and scan that, and you'll actually get, it'll send you to our blog where we talk about a decade of collaborations around television news, and then a roundup of all of our dashboards, data sets, and experiments around television news. Again, all of them open data. So everything you've seen here is all open data, available to journalists and scholars. We're really fascinated to work with you on how can we understand we turn on the television, that lens to the world. And most importantly, as the web itself is becoming more and more of a video-centric medium, whether that's TikTok, whether it's YouTube, whether that's the video you're watching right now, television news has so much to offer us in terms of understanding how we perform visual storytelling. What does visual storytelling look like across the world? Thank you so much for joining me. This is Kavli Taru with the GDELT Video Series.